A girl that we will call Amy for the sake of this story lives a pretty normal life. She lives in the suburbs, she goes to high school, and she loves hanging out at the park with her friends after school or on the weekends. On this fateful day, school lets out, and Amy heads to the park to hang out with her friends. And she hangs out for a bit, just chatting with her friends, but doesn't stay long at the park and decides to head home because she wants to make it back before her mom and dad get home from work. Home isn't far, it's only a few blocks, so she completes the short walk home, and as she opens the door, she hears something that confuses her. She hears what sounds like her parents having some sort of argument in the kitchen of their home. And when you enter the home, there's a small foyer, then a living room off to the left, and finally the kitchen behind a closed door. And she thought this was really odd because both of her parents should be at work. They rarely ever deviate from their normal routines, and when they do, they at least tell her first. She listens for a few seconds, and it clearly sounds like her parents having some sort of heated argument in the kitchen, but she's unable to make out any specific words that are being said. She's still standing frozen in the doorway, trying to make sense of the situation when she calls out, "Mom?" And as soon as she does this, the voices come to a screeching halt. The house falls eerily silent, and you could just hear a pin drop. She starts taking a few steps forward in the direction of the closed kitchen door. And things just feel off. There's a very strange stillness that's fallen over everything. And just as she's approaching the kitchen door, and she's about to reach out to open it, she hears something. "Hey, Amy, we're just in here." It was a voice from the other side of the kitchen door. It was only feet away now, very, very close. And it sounded like Amy's mom, but at the same time, it didn't at all. Amy just froze in place. Something about the voice just was not right. To the untrained ear, it sounded like Amy's mom, but to her, it was just wrong. It was as if the cadence of the voice was completely off, or that it sounded flat without any life in the voice. Something primal in Amy told her that this is wrong and she needs to run. So that's precisely what she did. She spun around and sprinted to the front door, making it outside and into the front lawn. She's standing in front of the house, not really sure what to do, when she turns back around and looked at the house, and in the downstairs window, this figure appeared with their face pressed close to the window. It was a face that looked like Amy's mother, but at the same time, it was completely devoid of all of the nuances and details that made up her mother's face. And the eyes of this figure seemed to simply stare off in some unfocused direction. They were kind of pointed at Amy, but at the same time she could tell that the eyes weren't really focusing on her, and the face had zero emotion on it. Amy knew something was horribly wrong, and she just lets out this scream and begins running down the street. Her mom worked only a few blocks away, and so she had to go to her mom's office and confirm, was this thing that she just saw through the window really her mother, or was her mother at the office? She bursts into her mother's office, this point pretty much in tears, and she confirms that there in the office, sitting at the desk, is her mother. And her mother tells her she hadn't left work since she arrived there this morning. Amy tells her mother about this terrifying experience that she just had in their home, and her mother's instinct is that somebody must have broken in, and Amy just happened to walk in while they were in mid-robbery. Her mother calls the police, who show up at the house to do a quick investigation, and they meet the police at their house. The police go in and they do a search of the building, but they find nothing. There's nobody inside. They invite Amy and her mother to come inside and look and see if anything of value had been taken, but nothing had been taken from the house. The house only had two entrances. There was a front door and there was a back door. Amy sees that the back door is still locked, And she knows that when she arrived home, she had unlocked the front door. So when she got home, both doors were locked. Whoever or whatever she saw in that house found a way to enter without using any of the doors. Amy can't say for certain what she saw that day, but in her gut, she believes that that figure that she saw was something evil. Many years ago, a man that we will call Scott was working as an on-call technician for an audio-visual company. Essentially, his job was to work with clients to kind of troubleshoot their AV equipment and ensure that it was working properly. And in the days prior to the internet, this job generally had to be done in person. So because of this, Scott traveled all around Central Florida, meeting with clients who ranged from major companies to schools to government buildings and everything in between. Back before everyone had a cell phone in their pocket, the only way to get in touch with somebody immediately would be if they were wearing a pager. Pagers were these devices that would usually strap on somebody's belt, and they would buzz when someone called their pager number, signaling to them that somebody was trying to get into contact with them. Scott's pager would even display the number that was trying to reach him, which was pretty high technology for the time. So if a client needed to reach Scott, they would call his pager number, they would input their phone number, and Scott would know who to call once he was able to get to a phone. And if the client needed help urgently, they would follow up their number with 911, which would signal to Scott that he needed to stop whatever he was doing and find a phone ASAP and get in touch with the client. One afternoon, Scott is traveling from Orlando to St. Petersburg along Interstate 4. His pager goes off and he glances down while he's driving to try to see if he recognizes the number, but it's a number that he doesn't recognize. But the number is followed by 911, so whoever this is, it must be a client who needs him urgently. So he starts looking for a spot where he can get off the interstate and find a payphone. Scott takes the first exit that he comes across and he pulls into this little truck stop. And back then, essentially all truck stops and rest stops and gas stations were equipped with payphones. So it was a pretty safe bet that he would be able to find one and get in touch with whoever this was that needed his help. He walks into the truck stop and he sees a wall in the back with 4 payphones on it, and he makes his way over to make a call. He double checks the number on his pager and he puts in his quarters and he dials the number, and then the phone starts ringing and ringing and ringing. And he's a little bit annoyed now. Like, why would somebody page him 911 and then not even pick up the phone when he calls them back? And only about 5 minutes have passed since he initially received the page, so it's not like it's been a long time. It's about that time that Scott notices another ringing. It's a ringing that's coming from a payphone that are 2 phones away from where he is. And for those who may not be old enough to remember, seeing a payphone ringing was a very unusual occurrence. Payphones were typically only used for outgoing calls, and so it was kind of a curiosity when you would hear one ringing. It seems like no one is answering Scott's call, so he hangs up his phone, and just as he hangs up his phone, the other phone that had been ringing stops ringing. And he's thinking, that's a little bit strange, and he gets this very weird feeling about this payphone. He walks over a few steps to the payphone that had just been ringing. Back then, payphones would sometimes have their own number printed on them. So Scott reads the number that's printed at the top of this payphone, and he checks the number that he received on his pager, and he feels goosebumps creep up all over his body. Because aside from the 911 at the end of this number that he received, the 2 numbers are identical. This means that whoever called him had called him from that payphone. Now this is starting to get really weird to him. Had somebody been paging him from this phone only a few minutes ago? And why would they do that? And how would they know that he was so close to that truck stop. He was literally one exit away from the truck stop. Scott sees a nearby kiosk in the truck stop, and there's a young woman inside of the kiosk. So he goes over and he asks her if she had seen anybody using that payphone. And the young woman tells him that he had been the only person to use that payphone or any of those payphones within the last hour. Scott is officially creeped out. I mean, think about the odds of this happening. He is paged by a payphone that happens to be off of the first exit on the interstate where he was driving. It just did not make any sense to him. Freaking out a little bit, Scott takes a moment to kind of calm himself down before he gets back in his car and starts getting back onto the interstate. And this whole ordeal from when he got the page to when he's now getting back onto the interstate took about 15 or 20 minutes, so now he's stressed out because he's running behind. After only about 10 minutes of driving, he comes upon a very disturbing scene along the interstate. It just looks like a bomb had gone off. There is debris scattered all over the road. Cars and trucks are piled up everywhere. Police and EMS are desperately trying to pull people from cars, and they're tending to severely wounded people on the road. And the whole interstate just looks like a war zone with people hurt and clinging to life, and it's just awful. Scott stops his car and he hops out and he rushes onto the scene thinking that maybe he can do something to help, whether it's pull somebody out of a car or treat somebody who's wounded. And as he's coming up onto the scene, one of the state troopers who were on scene comes up to him and explains to Scott what happened. And this semi-truck had been traveling down the interstate carrying this massive load of steel. And it went out of control. The semi-truck crashed and it sent tons and tons of steel flying in all directions, destroying several cars. Scott realizes that had he not stopped at that truck stop to respond to that page, he would have been on the interstate in that specific area when the crash happened. So he is convinced that that page saved his life, but he has no explanation for why he received it. It couldn't have been a wrong number because the caller knew to add 911 in order to make it urgent. But who was this caller? How did they have Scott's number? How did they know where Scott was on the interstate? And most strangely, how did they know that there was going to be a major accident in the direction that Scott was heading? Thank you for watching my spooky video. I really appreciate it, and tune in next time. Thank you.